In the annals of American crime, few names evoke as much visceral horror as Jeffrey Dahmer. For years he was an unassuming figure quietly haunting the streets of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. To his neighbors at the Oxford Apartments he was just a quiet, solitary man who kept to himself. But behind the closed door of apartment 213, a private hell was unfolding. Dahmer was not merely a killer, he was a collector of lives, a man driven by a desperate and twisted need to possess and control others completely, even in death. His story became infamous not just for the sheer number of his victims, but for the chilling nature of his crimes, which included acts of dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism. The public fascination with Jeffrey Dahmer stems from the stark contrast between his mundane exterior and the monstrous reality he concealed. He worked at a chocolate factory, a detail that seems almost cruelly ironic given the darkness he harbored. His ability to blend in, to appear unremarkable, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his entire saga. It challenges our fundamental assumptions about what evil looks like. We want to believe that monsters are easily identifiable, that they wear their malevolence on their sleeves. Dahmer's case proved that the most profound evil can hide in plain sight, masked by a facade of quiet normalcy that allowed him to operate with impunity for over a decade. His name is now synonymous with the darkest depths of human depravity. When his crimes were finally exposed to the world in the summer of 1991, the details were so gruesome, so beyond the pale of comprehension, that they seemed to belong to the realm of fiction. The story captivated and terrified the nation, dominating headlines and conversations. People struggled to understand the psychology of a man who could commit such atrocities. The case forced a collective reckoning with the nature of evil, the failures of our social systems, and the vulnerability of those living on the margins of society who became Dahmer's primary targets. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is more than just a true crime tale. It is a cautionary narrative about loneliness, obsession, and systemic failure. His crimes did not occur in a vacuum. They were enabled by a series of missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and societal prejudices that allowed him to continue his killing spree undetected. The silence from apartment 213 was broken only when one of his intended victims managed to escape, finally bringing an end to a reign of terror that had claimed the lives of 17 young men and boys. Unmasking the monster revealed not only the horrors he committed, but also the uncomfortable truths about the society that allowed him to flourish. To comprehend the monster, one must often look at the man, and to understand the man, one must examine the child. Jeffrey Dahmer's early life, born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, was marked by a profound and pervasive sense of isolation. As a young boy he was described as energetic and happy, but a double hernia surgery around the age of 4 seemed to coincide with a noticeable shift in his personality. He became increasingly withdrawn, shy, and disconnected from his peers. This emotional detachment was exacerbated by a tense and unstable home environment, where his parents, Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, were locked in a constant state of marital conflict, leaving young Jeffrey to navigate his formative years in an atmosphere of emotional neglect. This deep-seated loneliness manifested in unusual and disturbing hobbies. While other children played sports or collected stamps, Dahmer developed a fascination with animal carcasses. He would collect roadkill, squirrels, cats, and birds, and take them into the woods near his home in Bath, Ohio. There he would dissect them, examining their internal structures with a detached, scientific curiosity. He was particularly interested in bones, which he would bleach and preserve. This morbid preoccupation was an early, chilling indicator of the obsessions that would later define his horrific crimes against human beings, a rehearsal for the dismemberment and preservation he would later enact on his victims. The turmoil at home only worsened during his teenage years. His mother, Joyce, suffered from mental health issues, and the fighting between his parents grew more intense, culminating in their acrimonious divorce in 1978. During this period, Dahmer's social isolation deepened, and he began to drink heavily, often showing up to high school intoxicated. He was a ghost in the hallways, a loner whom classmates remembered for his strange pranks and unsettling behavior. It was also during this time that he began to grapple with his homosexuality, an aspect of his identity that he struggled to accept, and which further fueled his sense of alienation and self-loathing. The divorce of his parents served as a critical turning point. Shortly after his high school graduation, his mother moved away with his younger brother David, and his father moved into a motel, leaving the 18-year-old Jeffrey completely alone in the family home. This sudden and total abandonment left him adrift in a sea of his darkest impulses. With no supervision and no social connections to ground him, the fantasies of control and possession that had been brewing in his mind for years were now free to fester and grow. The stage was set for these fantasies to cross the threshold into a brutal and horrifying reality. The summer of 1978 was humid and heavy, mirroring the dark transition occurring within Jeffrey Dahmer. Left to his own devices in the empty family house in Ohio, his long-simmering fantasies of domination finally boiled over into action. On June 18, just 3 weeks after graduating from high school, he picked up a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Dahmer lured the 19-year-old back to his home with the promise of beer and music. His initial intent, as he would later claim, was simply to have company and perhaps a sexual encounter. But as Hicks prepared to leave, Dahmer was overcome by a desperate fear of being abandoned once more, a fear that triggered a homicidal rage. In a moment of brutal impulse, Dahmer struck Hicks from behind with a 10-pound dumbbell, killing him. The act shocked even Dahmer himself, but what followed was a chillingly methodical process of concealment. He dissected the young man's body in the crawl space of his home, a grotesque echo of his childhood experiments with animals. He then packed the remains into plastic bags and buried them in the woods behind the house. This first murder was a clumsy, impulsive act, but it established the foundational elements of his future crimes: the desire to keep his victims with him, the fear of abandonment, and the dismemberment of the body as a means of control and disposal. After killing Stephen Hicks, Dahmer's life continued its downward spiral. He briefly attended Ohio State University but dropped out after one semester due to his severe alcoholism. His father, concerned and frustrated, enlisted him in the U.S. Army. For a time, it seemed as though the structured environment might impose some discipline. He was trained as a medical specialist and stationed in West Germany. However, his drinking problem persisted and eventually led to his honorable discharge in 1981. The military had failed to contain the demons that plagued him, and upon his return to the United States, he was once again left to his own devices. He moved to Wisconsin to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in West Allis. For several years, he managed to suppress his homicidal urges, though his behavior remained deeply troubled. He was arrested for indecent exposure and disorderly conduct on multiple occasions. His grandmother, a devout woman, grew increasingly disturbed by his heavy drinking, the strange men he brought home, and the foul odors emanating from the basement. Unbeknownst to her, Dahmer was experimenting with mannequins, and had even brought home a victim he had drugged, though the man escaped. The monster was dormant, but he was far from gone. The first kill had opened a door that would never be closed again. Jeffrey Dahmer's method of operation was born from a twisted and pathetic desire for a compliant, permanent partner. He craved total control over another person, someone who would never leave him. To achieve this, he developed a chillingly consistent ritual. He primarily targeted young men, often from minority communities, whom he encountered at gay bars, bus stops, and shopping malls. He believed these individuals were less likely to be missed, and that their disappearances would attract less police attention. A grim calculation that proved tragically accurate. He would use his non-threatening appearance and offers of money or alcohol to lure them back to his private space, first his grandmother's house and later his Milwaukee apartment. Once his victim was in his control, Dahmer's primary goal was to render them helpless. He would typically drug their drinks with sleeping pills, such as Halcyon, to sedate them into a state of unconsciousness. This allowed him to act out his fantasies without resistance. He would sexually assault his victims while they were incapacitated, taking Polaroid photographs to document the process and preserve the moment. These photographs became trophies, mementos that he could revisit to prolong his sense of power and possession. His ultimate objective was to create a living zombie, a completely submissive partner. This led him to perform crude, lobotomy-like experiments, drilling holes into his victims' skulls and injecting acid or boiling water into their brains. These horrific attempts invariably failed, resulting in the victim's death. The murder itself was often the result of these failed experiments or strangulation. But for Dahmer, death was not the end. It was merely a transition. The act of killing was secondary to what came after. He was a necrophile, engaging in sexual acts with the corpses of his victims. This practice fulfilled his ultimate fantasy of having a partner who could not reject or abandon him. He would then dismember the bodies, a process he had refined since his first murder. This was not done out of a simple need to dispose of evidence but was an integral part of his ritual. It was an act of deconstruction, allowing him to examine and possess his victims in the most absolute way imaginable. Dahmer's obsession with preservation drove the final and perhaps most grotesque stage of his crimes. He would keep certain body parts as souvenirs, boiling and cleaning skulls and skeletons to keep as trophies. In some instances he engaged in cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims in a twisted belief that doing so would make them a permanent part of him. His apartment became a charnel house, a museum of death filled with human heads stored in the freezer, skeletons in the closet, and a 57-gallon drum filled with acid for dissolving remains. This macabre collection was the ultimate expression of his desperate, pathological need to conquer his profound loneliness. So, after being asked to leave his grandmother's house in 1988 due to his increasingly erratic behavior, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into the Oxford Apartments in a predominantly low-income minority neighborhood in Milwaukee. This move, well, it marked the beginning of the most prolific and horrifying phase of his killing spree. With his own private space and a newfound sense of autonomy, the restraints on his dark compulsions were completely removed. Between 1988 and his arrest in 1991, he murdered 12 young men and boys in his small one-bedroom apartment. The frequency of his killings escalated, sometimes with only a week or two passing between murders, as his need for stimulation grew more insatiable. Dahmer's life in Milwaukee settled into a grim routine. By day, he worked at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company, a job that provided him with a steady income and a veneer of normalcy. By night he prowled the city's gay bars and nightlife spots, searching for his next victim. He specifically targeted young men of color, Black, Asian and Latino, exploiting their social and economic vulnerability. He understood that these men, many of whom were marginalized and disconnected from support systems, were less likely to be reported missing. This calculated predation underscored a chilling awareness of societal biases and the cracks in the system through which his victims could easily fall. The environment of the Oxford Apartments contributed to his ability to operate without suspicion. The building was known for its transient population, and strange noises or foul odors were often dismissed by residents who were accustomed to a degree of chaos and decay. Neighbors complained to the building manager about the horrific smells emanating from Dahmer's apartment. Odors he explained away as spoiled meat or backed-up plumbing. He would use incense and air fresheners to try to mask the scent of decomposition, a constant reminder of the gruesome activities taking place within his walls. His quiet, introverted demeanor helped him evade serious scrutiny, as few could imagine the horrors he was committing. During this period, Dahmer had several close calls that should have led to his capture. He had a prior conviction for second-degree sexual assault and child enticement from 1988, for which he served a mere 10 months in jail. He was on probation during the height of his killing spree, but his probation officer conducted only cursory visits and never entered his apartment. His neighbors made numerous complaints about unsettling sounds and smells, yet these were never investigated thoroughly. This pattern of impunity emboldened Dahmer, reinforcing his belief that he was invisible and could continue his reign of terror without consequence, all while the body count in his apartment grew steadily higher. The night of July 22, 1991 was really the beginning of the end for Jeffrey Dahmer. His downfall, interestingly enough, didn't come from some brilliant piece of detective work, but from the incredible bravery of one of his intended victims. Dahmer had lured a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards back to his apartment with the promise of money and beer. Once inside, the familiar, horrifying script began to play out. Dahmer slapped a handcuff on one of Edwards' wrists, brandished a large knife, and told him he was going to watch a movie while Dahmer listened to his heart. As Dahmer led him into the bedroom, Edwards saw the chilling evidence of his predicament, a 57-gallon drum emitting a chemical odor and Polaroid pictures of dismembered bodies scattered about. Realizing he was in mortal danger, Tracy Edwards knew he had to escape or die. He feigned compliance, just waiting for a moment when Dahmer's guard was down. As Dahmer became momentarily distracted, Edwards saw his chance. In a desperate bid for his life, he punched Dahmer in the face, knocking him off balance, and fled from the apartment with one handcuff still dangling from his wrist. He ran out into the street and flagged down a passing police car, frantically telling the two officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Muller, that a freak had pulled a knife on him and handcuffed him. The officers, though initially skeptical, agreed to accompany Edwards back to apartment 213 to retrieve the key. When the officers arrived at the apartment, Dahmer, ever the composed manipulator, greeted them calmly, and attempted to explain the situation away as a misunderstanding between two lovers. He offered to get the key for the handcuff. As Officer Mueller followed him into the bedroom, he noticed an open drawer containing a collection of shocking Polaroid photographs depicting human bodies in various states of mutilation and dismemberment. Stunned, Mueller showed one of the photos to his partner and exclaimed, "These are real!" At that moment, the mask of normalcy that Dahmer had worn for so long finally shattered, revealing the monster underneath. Dahmer attempted to resist arrest, but he was quickly subdued. As he was being placed in the police car, he reportedly murmured, "For what I did, I should be dead." What the police discovered inside apartment 213 confirmed their worst fears and plunged the city of Milwaukee into a state of shock. The apartment was a veritable house of horrors. They found 4 severed heads in the kitchen, a human heart in the freezer, and a torso in a barrel of acid. Skulls, skeletons, and preserved organs were stored throughout the small apartment. The grisly discovery brought an abrupt end to over a decade of terror, and finally exposed the full, unimaginable scope of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes to a horrified world. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer, which began in January 1992, was a media spectacle that really captured the world's attention. Dahmer had already confessed to the murders in extensive detail, leaving little doubt about his guilt. So the trial didn't center on whether he had committed the acts, but on his state of mind when he did them. His defense team entered a plea of guilty but insane, arguing that Dahmer was driven by an uncontrollable mental illness, specifically necrophilia, and therefore was not criminally responsible for his actions. The prosecution, however, contended that despite his depraved motives, Dahmer was sane, meticulous, and methodical in his crimes, fully aware that what he was doing was wrong. The courtroom proceedings were harrowing, forcing the jury and the public to confront the gruesome details of Dahmer's crimes. The prosecution presented evidence of his calculated methods, how he lured his victims, drugged them, and attempted to hide his activities. They pointed to the fact that he had managed to hold down a job and maintain a facade of normalcy as proof of his sanity. The defense, in turn, presented expert psychiatric testimony, arguing that his obsessions were so powerful that they constituted a mental disease that he could not control. The jury was ultimately tasked with the difficult decision of determining whether Dahmer was evil or insane. After 2 weeks of testimony, they sided with the prosecution, finding him sane at the time of the murders. On February 17, 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin and sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, totaling 957 years in prison, a sentence designed to ensure he would never again be a free man. He was later extradited to Ohio to face charges for the murder of Stephen Hicks, his first victim, for which he received a 16th life sentence. During his sentencing, the courtroom was filled with the raw, emotional testimony of the victims' families who shared their immeasurable grief and anger. In a brief statement, Dahmer himself took responsibility, saying, "I take all the blame for what I did," but his words offered little comfort to those whose lives he had shattered. Dahmer's life in prison was fraught with danger. He was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he was initially placed in protective custody for his own safety. However, in his second year of incarceration, he requested to be moved into the general population, believing he had found religious faith and wanting more interaction. This decision proved to be fatal. On the morning of November 28, 1994, while on cleaning duty in the prison gymnasium, Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, were attacked by a fellow prisoner named Christopher Scarver. Scarver bludgeoned both men to death with a metal bar from the weight room, bringing a violent end to the life of one of history's most infamous serial killers. The horrific saga of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just the story of a lone predator. It is also a damning indictment of the systemic failures that allowed him to hunt with impunity for so long. Numerous opportunities to stop him were missed by law enforcement and the justice system, which repeatedly failed to see the danger he posed. These failures were not random accidents, but were rooted in deep-seated issues of homophobia, racism, and negligence. The police often dismissed the concerns of the communities Dahmer preyed upon, viewing the conflicts he was involved in as gay domestic disputes, not worthy of serious investigation. a prejudice that proved to have deadly consequences for his victims. The most glaring and tragic example of this failure occurred on May 27, 1991, just 2 months before his final arrest. A neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, and her family saw a naked and disoriented teenager stumbling in the alley behind the Oxford Apartments. The boy, 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphony, was bleeding and appeared to be drugged. They called 911 for help. When police arrived, Dahmer appeared and calmly explained that the boy was his 19-year-old lover and that they had simply had a drunken argument. Despite the clear evidence that Synthesomphone was a minor and in distress, the officers believed Dahmer's story, even joking about the situation. They escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment, leaving him to his fate. He was murdered shortly after. This incident was not an isolated case of poor judgment. It was part of a pattern of police indifference and incompetence. The officers who returned Konorak Synthesomphone to Dahmer were later fired, but were eventually reinstated with back pay after a lengthy appeals process, a decision that sparked public outrage. Furthermore, Dahmer was on probation for a prior child molestation conviction during the peak of his killing spree. His probation officer charged with monitoring him failed to conduct thorough checks, never once setting foot inside the apartment where the murders were taking place. These routine check-ins were superficial at best, representing a catastrophic breakdown in the supervisory systems meant to protect the public. The failures extended beyond individual officers to the system as a whole. The disappearances of numerous young men of color from Milwaukee's gay community did not trigger the kind of widespread alarm or intensive investigation that might have occurred if the victims had been from a different demographic. Their marginalization made them invisible, not only to Dahmer but also to the authorities who were supposed to protect them. The Dahmer case forced a painful and necessary conversation about how race, class, and sexual orientation impact policing and justice in America. It revealed that the monster in apartment 213 was enabled by a society that too often looked away from the people he chose to destroy. Decades after his death, the shadow of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to loom large over our collective consciousness, his story perpetually resurrected by a culture captivated by true crime. His name has become a byword for ultimate evil, a reference point for the darkest extremes of human behavior. This enduring fascination is fueled by a steady stream of books, documentaries, and dramatizations that attempt to dissect his psyche and recount his horrific deeds. The 2022 Netflix series brought his crimes to a new generation, becoming a massive global hit and sparking renewed debate about the ethics of portraying such traumatic events for entertainment. The explosion of interest in Dahmer's story highlights the complex and often controversial nature of the true crime genre. While many viewers and readers are driven by a psychological need to understand what makes a person commit such atrocities, these portrayals often come at a cost. Families of the victims have repeatedly spoken out against the commercialization of their pain, arguing that these productions reopen old wounds and reduce their loved ones to mere plot points in a killer's narrative. The glamorization of killers, even when unintentional, can be deeply disrespectful to the memory of those who were lost and the communities that were terrorized by their actions. The continued success of projects related to the case, such as the anthology series, which earned numerous Emmy nominations in 2025 for its season on the Menendez brothers, shows that the public's appetite for these dark stories is not waning. This trend raises important questions about our societal consumption of tragedy. Are we seeking to learn from the past, or are we simply indulging a morbid curiosity? The Dahmer case in particular forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about the killer, but about ourselves and the systems we inhabit. It serves as a stark reminder of the police failures and societal prejudices that allowed him to operate, lessons that remain profoundly relevant today. Ultimately, the legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is a dual one. On one hand, it is a chilling case study of psychopathy, a deep dive into a mind utterly devoid of empathy. On the other, it is a powerful cautionary tale about the importance of listening to the marginalized, holding institutions accountable, and recognizing the humanity of every individual. The 17 young men and boys who lost their lives were not just statistics or characters in a horror story, they were sons, brothers, and friends whose futures were stolen. Remembering Jeffrey Dahmer should not be about glorifying the monster, but about honoring his victims and committing to building a society where such failures and such profound darkness can never again go unnoticed for so long.